Welcome back to another incredible story. If you're new here, this channel brings you powerful emotional narratives every week. Stories about family, secrets, and the choices that change everything. Subscribe now so you never miss an upload. Trust me, today's story will leave you speechless. Let's begin.
Sarah Mitchell stared at the diamond ring on her finger, its brilliance catching the afternoon light, streaming through the window of the luxury hotel suite in London, where she had just agreed to marry Prince Rashid Al Khalifa of Bahrain, a man she had met only 3 months earlier at a charity gala in Manhattan. She was a 32-year-old art curator from Boston, never imagining that her life would take such an extraordinary turn. Yet here she was, engaged to actual royalty, her heart racing with excitement and a whisper of something else she couldn't quite name. Rashid was everything she had dreamed of, tall and handsome with warm brown eyes that seemed to see into her soul, educated at Oxford and Harvard, fluent in 5 languages, and possessing a gentle charm that had swept her off her feet from their very first conversation about Renaissance paintings. He had courted her with a romance straight out of a fairy tale, private jets to Paris for dinner, weekend trips to his villa in Monaco, and always, he was attentive, kind, and deeply interested in everything she had to say. When he proposed on the rooftop of the Shard with the entire city of London spread out beneath them like a carpet of stars, she had said yes without hesitation, her practical Boston upbringing momentarily forgotten in the face of such overwhelming passion. But as she looked at the ring now, she remembered something odd that one of Rashid's cousins had mentioned at the engagement party the night before, a fleeting comment about how Rashid had such bad luck with wives, and the way the woman's eyes had flickered with something that looked almost like warning before she quickly excused herself and disappeared into the crowd. Sarah had brushed it off at the time, assuming it was just jealousy or cultural differences she didn't yet understand. But now, alone in the quiet of her suite, the comment echoed in her mind with an uncomfortable persistence. She knew Rashid had been married before. He had told her that himself, explaining that his first wife had died in a tragic accident and his second marriage had ended in divorce, both painful experiences that had left him hesitant to open his heart again until he met Sarah. The way he had told her, with such genuine sadness in his eyes, had only made her love him more, seeing his vulnerability as proof of his depth of feeling. Yet something about the cousin's words nagged at her, a tiny seed of doubt that she tried to dismiss even as it began to take root. When Rashid returned to the suite an hour later, she was determined to put her concerns aside, losing herself in his embrace and the excitement of planning their wedding, which was to take place in Bahrain in just 6 weeks. The preparations consumed her completely, fittings for her custom-made wedding dress, meetings with wedding planners via video call, learning basic Arabic phrases, and reading everything she could about Bahraini culture and customs. Her friends back in Boston were thrilled for her, though she could detect notes of concern in their voices when they asked if she was sure she was ready to move halfway around the world for a man she had known for such a short time. Her mother, ever practical, had been more direct, asking pointed questions about prenuptial agreements and what would happen if things didn't work out, concerns that Sarah had laughed off with the confidence of a woman deeply in love. She had always been the sensible one, the planner, the one who made pros and cons lists before making any major decision. But with Rashid, all of that had fallen away, replaced by a certainty she had never felt before. The 6 weeks passed in a blur of activity, and before she knew it, Sarah was on a private plane heading to Bahrain, her mother and best friend Emma accompanying her for the wedding. As they descended toward Bahrain International Airport, Sarah pressed her face to the window, taking in her first glimpse of what would be her new home, a landscape of gleaming skyscrapers rising from the desert, connected by highways that sparkled in the intense Middle Eastern sun. Rashid met them at the airport personally, breaking protocol to greet Sarah with the warm embrace before ushering them into a convoy of luxury vehicles that whisked them to the family compound, a sprawling palace complex that took Sarah's breath away with its blend of traditional Islamic architecture and modern opulence. The next few days were a whirlwind of meeting relatives, attending pre-wedding celebrations, and trying not to feel overwhelmed by the grandeur of everything around her. Rashid's family was enormous, and while most of them were welcoming, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that some of the women looked at her with a mixture of pity and something else she couldn't quite identify. She mentioned this to Emma one evening as they sat in Sarah's suite, which was larger than her entire apartment back in Boston, decorated with silk curtains and Persian rugs that probably cost more than she made in a year. Emma, always protective, had suggested that maybe some of them were just jealous or uncomfortable with Rashid marrying a Western woman, but she also admitted that she had overheard some whispered conversations in Arabic that had stopped abruptly when she approached. The wedding day arrived with all the pageantry Sarah had imagined and more, hundreds of guests, a ceremony that blended Western and Islamic traditions, and a reception in the palace gardens that looked like something out of Arabian Nights, with fountains, roses, and strings of lights turning the evening into pure magic. Sarah felt like a princess from a storybook as she danced with Rashid under the stars, his hand warm on her waist, his eyes full of love and promises for their future together. But even in that moment of perfect happiness, she noticed his aunt watching them from across the garden, her expression unreadable, and when their eyes met, the older woman had simply shaken her head slowly before turning away. After the wedding, Rashid took Sarah on a brief honeymoon to the Maldives, 2 weeks of paradise in an overwater bungalow where the world consisted only of turquoise water, white sand, and each other. It was perfect, almost too perfect, and Sarah found herself relaxing completely for the first time since arriving in Bahrain, her earlier concerns fading in the face of such overwhelming happiness. Rashid was an attentive and passionate husband, and they spent their days diving in coral reefs, dining on fresh seafood, and talking for hours about their dreams and plans. He wanted to show her the world, he said, to take her to every country she had ever wanted to visit, to fill their lives with art and beauty and love. When she asked him about his previous marriages, he had grown quiet, pain flickering across his face before he explained that his first wife, Amira, had died in a car accident just 2 years into their marriage, and his second wife, Katerina, a Russian model, had found the restrictions of royal life unbearable and had left him after only 18 months, taking a substantial settlement and disappearing back to Moscow. The way he talked about them, with such obvious hurt and regret, made Sarah's heart ache for him, and she vowed silently that she would be different, that their marriage would last forever. When they returned to Bahrain, they moved into their own wing of the family compound, a private space that Rashid had renovated specifically for them, with a modern kitchen, a library for Sarah's growing collection of art books, and a studio where she could work on curating exhibitions for the National Museum, a position Rashid had helped arrange for her. Life settled into a routine that was both exciting and comfortable. Mornings spent at the museum working with ancient artifacts and contemporary artists, afternoons sometimes devoted to language lessons or charity work with the Royal Foundation, and evenings with Rashid, either entertaining guests or enjoying quiet dinners alone. Sarah found herself adapting to her new life more easily than she had expected, making friends among the expat community and learning to navigate the complex social dynamics of the royal family. Yet despite all this happiness, she couldn't completely silence the small voice in her head that kept whispering that something was wrong. It started with small things, the way servants would sometimes look at her with what seemed like sympathy, the conversations that would stop when she entered a room, the fact that whenever she asked about family history or looked at old photo albums, any pictures of Rashid's previous wives seemed to have been removed. She told herself she was being paranoid, that it was natural for a family to want to move past painful memories, but the feeling persisted and grew stronger. 3 months into her marriage, Sarah was having tea with one of the younger princesses, Layla, a cousin who had studied in London and seemed more Western in her attitudes than most of the family. As they sat in the garden, Layla had looked around nervously before leaning in close and whispering that Sarah should be careful, that the family had secrets that were better left buried, and that if Sarah knew what was good for her, she would stop asking questions about the past. When Sarah pressed for more information, Layla had grown frightened and refused to say anything else, hurrying away and avoiding Sarah for weeks afterward. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep, lying awake next to Rashid and wondering what Layla had meant, what secrets the family could possibly be hiding that would warrant such a warning. She thought about asking Rashid directly, but something stopped her, an instinct that told her he would only give her the same answers he had given before, and that pushing too hard might drive a wedge between them just when their marriage was beginning to find its rhythm. Instead, she decided to do some investigating on her own, starting with internet searches about Rashid's previous wives. What she found confused her more than it enlightened her. There was almost nothing online about Amira, beyond a brief announcement of her marriage to Rashid and a small obituary noting her death in a car accident, with no details about the circumstances or even a photo. Katerina was slightly better documented, with some old modeling photos and society page mentions of her marriage to Rashid. But after the divorce, she seemed to have vanished completely, with no social media presence, no further modeling work, and no trace of her in Moscow or anywhere else. Sarah told herself that wealthy people often kept low profiles, especially after difficult divorces, but the complete absence of information felt wrong somehow, too thorough to be accidental. She began paying more attention to the family dynamics, noticing how Rashid's mother would sometimes watch her with an expression of deep sadness, how his younger brother would avoid meeting her eyes, how the older generation seemed to treat her with a formal distance that felt more like resignation than respect. One afternoon at the museum, Sarah was cataloging artifacts for an upcoming exhibition when she came across a box of old photographs from the 1990s, images of royal family events and celebrations. She was flipping through them idly when she came across a photo that made her heart stop. It showed a younger Rashid at what appeared to be a wedding reception, standing next to a beautiful woman in a white dress who must have been Amira. But what caught Sarah's attention was the woman's expression. She wasn't smiling. Her eyes were wide with what looked like fear, and her body language suggested she was trying to pull away from Rashid even as he held her close. Sarah stared at the photo for a long time, trying to tell herself she was reading too much into a single moment captured on film, but she couldn't shake the chill that ran down her spine. She quickly took a photo of the picture with her phone before replacing it in the box, unsure what she would do with the information, but knowing she needed to keep it. That evening, she tried to act normal around Rashid, but he seemed to sense her mood, asking if something was wrong at work or if she was feeling homesick. She assured him everything was fine, hating herself for lying, but not ready to confront him with her suspicions when she didn't even know what she was suspecting. The breakthrough came 2 weeks later when Sarah attended a charity luncheon for women's education, an event organized by the Royal Foundation. She found herself seated next to an elderly woman named Fatima, who had worked for the royal family for over 40 years as a palace administrator. As they chatted over lunch, Sarah carefully steered the conversation toward family history, and Fatima, perhaps because she was old enough not to care about consequences, or perhaps because she thought Sarah deserved to know the truth, began to open up. She spoke carefully, in English heavily accented but clear, about how she had watched the family for decades, had seen many things that troubled her conscience. When Sarah asked about Rashid's previous wives, Fatima's face had grown grave, and she had glanced around to make sure no one was listening before saying in a low voice that some stories were better left untold, but that if Sarah valued her life, she should find a way to leave before it was too late. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. The casual mention of her life being in danger seemed impossible, surreal, and yet Fatima's expression was completely serious. Before Sarah could ask what she meant, Fatima had quickly stood up, muttering something about needing to leave, and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Sarah sitting alone with her heart racing and her mind spinning. She spent the rest of the luncheon in a daze, mechanically making small talk, while internally panicking, trying to decide what to do with this information, whether to believe it or dismiss it as the ramblings of an old woman. When she got home, she found Rashid waiting for her, his expression stormy, and he demanded to know what she had been discussing with Fatima. Sarah felt ice run through her veins at the question, realizing that she was being watched, that the family had informants everywhere keeping track of her conversations. She tried to play it off as innocent conversation, but Rashid cut her off, his voice sharp in a way she had never heard before, telling her that she needed to stop asking questions about things that didn't concern her, that she was his wife now and needed to respect the family's privacy. It was the first time he had ever spoken to her harshly, and Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. But beneath the hurt was a growing fear that made her hand shake. She apologized, saying she hadn't meant to pry, that she was just curious about family history, and after a tense moment, Rashid's expression softened, and he pulled her into his arms, apologizing for snapping at her, explaining that there were painful memories he didn't like to revisit. She let him hold her, but even as she pressed her face against his chest, she was plotting her next move, knowing she needed to find out the truth, but also aware that she had to be much more careful. That night, after Rashid fell asleep, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind working through everything she knew. 2 previous wives, both gone under mysterious circumstances, a family that seemed to be hiding something, warnings from multiple people, and now Rashid's angry reaction to her asking questions. She thought about calling Emma or her mother, but what would she tell them? That she had a bad feeling? That people were giving her cryptic warnings? Without concrete proof, she would sound paranoid, and besides, her calls were probably monitored, her emails likely read, her movements tracked. She was trapped in a gilded cage, and she was only now beginning to understand just how trapped she really was. The next day, Sarah made a decision. She would investigate on her own, quietly and carefully, and if she found evidence that her suspicions were correct, she would find a way to leave. Consequences be damned. She started by trying to find people who had known Amira and Katerina, a task that proved more difficult than she expected because most people either claimed not to remember them or refused to discuss them at all. She finally found a lead through one of the museum volunteers, an older woman named Miriam, who mentioned casually that she had been friends with Amira's mother before the family left Bahrain. When Sarah asked why they had left, Miriam had hesitated before explaining that after Amira's death, her family had been given a substantial sum of money and strongly encouraged to relocate to Egypt, which they had done with suspicious speed. Sarah's blood ran cold at this information, the pieces starting to come together in a pattern that horrified her. She asked if Miriam knew what had happened to Katerina's family, and the woman had shaken her head, saying that Katerina's parents had been killed in a suspicious house fire in Moscow 6 months after Katerina's divorce, a tragedy that had been investigated but ultimately ruled accidental despite numerous irregularities. Sarah thanked Miriam and left quickly, her heart pounding, her mind reeling from what she had just learned. If what Miriam said was true, if families of Rashid's previous wives had died or been paid off to leave the country, then what had actually happened to Amira and Katerina? Had they really died and divorced, or was the truth something far darker? She thought about Fatima's warning, about Layla's fear, about the way the family looked at her with what she now recognized as pity, and she realized with horrifying clarity that she might be in serious danger. She needed to get proof, something concrete that she could use to protect herself, something that would give her leverage or at least explain what was really going on. That night, she waited until Rashid left for a business dinner, claiming she had a headache so she could stay home, and then she did something she never thought she would do. She broke into his private study. Her hands shook as she tried the door, finding it unlocked, perhaps because Rashid never imagined she would dare to invade his privacy. The study was elegant and masculine, filled with leather-bound books and expensive artwork, with a large desk dominating the center of the room. Sarah went straight to the desk, trying drawers and finding most of them unlocked, filled with business documents and correspondence that seemed innocuous enough. She was about to give up when she tried the bottom drawer on the right side and found it locked. Her heart racing, she searched for the key, finally finding it taped to the underside of the desk, a hiding place that seemed almost too obvious. The drawer opened to reveal a small metal box, also locked, and Sarah almost cried with frustration before noticing another key taped inside the drawer. With shaking hands, she opened the box, and what she found inside made her stomach drop. There were 3 passports, the first belonging to Amira, the second to Katerina, and the third blank, waiting for its owner. Next to the passports was a stack of photographs, images of Amira and Katerina in various settings. But what made Sarah's blood run cold was that many of the photos appeared to have been taken without the women's knowledge, shots through windows, long-distance surveillance photos, images that suggested stalking rather than affection. Beneath the photos was a leather journal, and Sarah opened it with trembling hands to find page after page of notes in Rashid's handwriting, detailed observations about his wives' behavior, their schedules, who they talked to, what they said, a level of monitoring that went far beyond normal concern and into obsession. The entries for Amira ended abruptly with a single line written in red ink that said, "Problem solved, accident successful, family cooperative." Sarah felt bile rise in her throat as she turned to the entries for Katerina, which were even more detailed and paranoid, documenting Rashid's growing suspicion that she was planning to leave him, his anger at her disrespect, his determination to teach her a lesson. These entries ended with another red ink notation that read, "Moscow operation completed, no loose ends." Sarah's hands were shaking so badly, she almost dropped the journal, the full horror of what she was reading crashing over her like a wave. Rashid hadn't just been married twice before. He had murdered his previous wives and possibly their families, and he had kept trophies of his crimes like some kind of serial killer. She suddenly understood why everyone had been trying to warn her, why people looked at her with pity, why there was a third blank passport in the box, waiting for her. She was living with a monster, sleeping next to a killer, and if he ever suspected that she knew the truth, she would be next. Sarah quickly took photos of everything with her phone, the passports, the surveillance photos, the journal entries, knowing she needed evidence if she was going to survive this. She carefully put everything back exactly as she had found it, locked the box and drawer, replaced the keys, and slipped out of the study, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She went back to her bedroom and locked herself in the bathroom, sitting on the floor with her back against the door, trying to control her breathing, trying to think clearly through her panic. She couldn't let Rashid know that she knew, couldn't give any sign that anything was wrong, because the moment he suspected, she was dead. She needed to get out of Bahrain, needed to get to safety, but she was being watched constantly. Her passport was locked in a safe she didn't have access to, and she was in a foreign country with no allies and no resources beyond what Rashid provided. She thought about going to the police, but the royal family was above the law in Bahrain, and besides, who would believe her accusations against a prince? She thought about reaching out to the American embassy, but would they intervene in what they might see as a domestic dispute? She felt trapped, suffocated, desperate, and terrified, but she forced herself to calm down, to think rationally, to make a plan. She stayed in the bathroom until she heard Rashid return home. Then she carefully composed herself, wiped her eyes, and went out to greet him with a smile, asking about his dinner, playing the role of the loving wife even as her skin crawled at his touch. Over the next few days, Sarah became an actress, performing the role of her life, being cheerful and affectionate with Rashid, attending her duties at the museum, making small talk at family dinners, all while secretly planning her escape. She realized she needed help from outside, someone who could get her out of the country safely. So she began looking for opportunities to contact her family or friends without being monitored. The chance came when she was invited to speak at an international museum conference in Dubai, a 2-day trip that Rashid initially resisted before finally agreeing, perhaps because the conference was legitimate and refusing would have raised questions. He insisted that 2 security guards accompany her, men who Sarah knew were there to watch her rather than protect her, but it was still her best chance. She packed carefully, including a small USB drive where she had transferred all the photos from Rashid's study, hiding it in a tampon box that she knew male security guards would be too uncomfortable to search. The conference in Dubai felt like a lifeline, a brief taste of freedom, and Sarah used every moment carefully. She gave her presentation on ancient Mesopotamian art, networked with colleagues, and waited for her opportunity. On the second day, she managed to slip away from her security detail for 15 minutes by claiming she needed to use the restroom, and in that precious window of time, she went to a hotel business center and sent an email from a guest computer to Emma, explaining everything in stark, hurried terms, including attachments of the photos from Rashid's study, and begging Emma to contact the American embassy and her family. She also sent a copy to her lawyer in Boston, with instructions to make the information public if anything happened to her. Then she deleted the browser history, rushed back to the conference, and hoped desperately that it would be enough. When she returned to Bahrain that evening, Rashid was waiting for her at the airport, his smile warm, his kiss affectionate, and Sarah felt sick with the knowledge that this man who seemed to love her was planning to kill her. She wondered when he would do it, whether he was waiting for a specific trigger or just the right opportunity, and she knew she couldn't wait to find out. That night, She barely slept, jumping at every sound, watching Rashid as he slept peacefully beside her, wondering how someone could look so normal and be so monstrous. The next morning, she went to the museum as usual, trying to maintain her routine, trying not to show any signs of panic. She was cataloging artifacts when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that simply said, "Extraction planned. Midnight tonight. Be ready. Destroy this message." Sarah's heart leaped with hope mixed with terror. Emma had come through, had contacted someone who could help, but now she had to survive until midnight without raising Rashid's suspicions. She deleted the message and went through her day mechanically, having lunch with colleagues, attending a meeting about the upcoming exhibition, making polite conversation with the museum director, all while her mind raced with plans and contingencies. That evening, she suggested to Rashid that they have a quiet night at home, just the two of them, her last attempt to seem normal and unsuspecting. They had dinner together in their private dining room, and Sarah forced herself to eat, to laugh at his jokes, to respond to his touches, playing her role to perfection even as every fiber of her being screamed to run. After dinner, she pleaded fatigue and went to bed early, leaving Rashid in the sitting room watching television. She waited, staring at the clock on her phone, counting down the minutes, her packed bag hidden in the back of her closet, containing only essential documents, cash, and the USB drive with evidence against Rashid. At 11:45, she heard Rashid come into the bedroom, and she pretended to be asleep, controlling her breathing, keeping her body relaxed as he moved around the room preparing for bed. She felt him pause near her, his presence looming, and forced herself to remain utterly still, her mind replaying every scene and warning that led to this moment. After Rashid finally settled into bed, the slow rhythm of his relaxed breathing told Sarah he was asleep, or at least pretending to be. She waited another 10 agonizing minutes, heart pounding in her chest, so loudly she worried it might wake him. At midnight exactly, Sarah slipped quietly out of bed, moving with practiced care across the room, grabbing her small bag and double-checking the contents one last time. Cash, documents, the USB drive. She pulled on a lightweight jacket and tiptoed out of the bedroom, each sound magnified in the silent darkness of the palace. She navigated the halls she'd memorized over months of living there, moving toward the side entrance, where Fatima had once shown her a hidden exit used by staff during emergencies. As she reached the service corridor, a shiver ran through her. What if Rashid woke up and saw she was gone? What if one of the night guards stopped her? She pressed on, recalling Layla's words, secrets that were better left buried. This was her only chance. A car was waiting down the deserted lane, headlights off, engine softly idling. Sarah recognized the silhouette of the driver, a friend of Emma's, sent by the embassy contact, who gave her a quick nod as she approached. She ducked into the back seat, her heart in her throat, waiting to be discovered, to hear shouts or alarms. But the car pulled smoothly away from the palace, winding through empty streets toward the edge of Manama. As they sped through the city, Sarah looked back, the palace receding behind her like a distant dream. She steeled herself for whatever came next, clutching her bag, a lifeline, her evidence, her last hope. The driver spoke little, communicating in clipped phrases. Passport ready? Documents secure? Stay out of sight. He handed her a scarf and sunglasses, urging her to cover her hair and face. At the embassy's side entrance, another man met her, a consulate worker, grave and focused. You're safe now, he said in a low voice. But we must move quickly. There's a flight to Frankfurt booked under an alias. You'll be escorted to Boston from there. Inside the embassy, Sarah trembled, almost unable to process what was happening. An hour later, she was in a convoy to Bahrain International, her departure zipped through security with discreet diplomatic intervention. She never saw Rashid again. As the plane climbed into the night sky, Sarah stared out the window, tears streaming down her face, tears of relief, terror, and heartbreak. Landing in Frankfurt, Sarah was met by U.S. security agents. She replayed for them every detail, handing over the USB drive, recounting Rashid's journal and the evidence she'd collected, the surveillance, the red ink statements, the family disappearances. The agents assured her she'd done everything right, but warned her that the Al Khalifa family's reach extended far. For her safety, Sarah was taken into protective custody, moved under a new identity, her story classified for now. Months passed before Sarah could contact Emma and her family. The investigation into Rashid was slow and fraught, the Bahraini government resistant, the royal family denying everything. But the evidence she gathered made international headlines. A prince exposed for sinister crimes behind regal facades. Amira and Katerina's families, tracked down by investigators, corroborated Sarah's account. Large payouts, threats, tragic accidents, families forced into exile. The world watched as secrets emerged, the palace walls unable to contain the truth. Through it all, Sarah rebuilt her life, finding solace in art again, her expertise now a tool for recovery. She spoke at humanitarian conferences, advocating for women's rights in oppressive societies, always under a new name, always looking over her shoulder. Yet the shadow of Rashid never faded. She found herself haunted by questions. How close had she come to disaster? Why had so many tried to warn her, yet none had been able to intervene until it was nearly too late? One evening, sitting alone in a Boston cafe, Sarah contemplated her journey. Love, deception, escape, survival. She wondered if Rashid missed her, if he regretted anything, if anyone truly knew what happened to his previous wives. The scars remained, but so did her spirit. She was no longer a princess in a palace. She was a survivor with stories to tell. Looking directly at the camera of her own reflection in the cafe window, she whispered, "How many more secrets remain hidden behind royal doors?" Her story, just like Amira's and Katerina's, was one of resilience and revelation, a warning for others, a call to courage. And as the lights of the city flickered on outside, Sarah vowed she would never again ignore the questions that began as whispers and grew into shouts. In the silent darkness, sometimes survival depends not on fairy tales, but on listening closely to the truth that waits behind every closed door.